I've received a couple of questions about selling the items I've fixed, and most of the questions have to do with pricing and returns. But I don't think many have asked me about warranty work, and if you have, well, your memory is better than mine. So what happens when I get a customer who wants me to fix a machine I've sold them years ago? Well, sometimes it's a rough situation, but this one had me asking more questions and getting very little in answers. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Weedeater brand string trimmer. And the problem is that it won't start because the fuel lines are in poor condition and broken. Now obviously, no fuel is going to make it to the carb in this condition, but my main concern is how it got this bad so soon. Now before we get too far into this project, I'm going to document as many of the stickers I can find. That way if we need to order new parts, we'll hopefully get the right ones. Now I'm going to try and repair this string trimmer, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Of course, the first thing we need to do is to get rid of the old fuel lines, that way we can install the new ones. That includes taking out what's left in the fuel tank and possibly reusing them depending upon what kind of condition they're in. So here's the fuel filter, but where's the old fuel line at? It should be attached to it, or it should be loose inside the fuel tank. And after asking the owner what happened to it, turns out they had tried fixing it themselves but got frustrated and decided to let someone else finish it. Now it all makes sense why the lines were broken and things were missing. All we have to do now is fix what's been broken. Now for this fuel tank, I'll be using a 3/16 of an inch fuel line, but yours might have two different sizes. So here's a tip. To help get the fuel lines into the tank, cut them at an angle. This will make it a whole lot easier to do. That and a good pair of bent pliers helps out a lot too. Now the first line I'm installing is the return line, but you're welcome to install whichever one you want first. And to help keep the return line from coming loose, I like to pull in about an inch of line into the tank. But you are welcome to make it as long as you want. It won't really hurt anything if you do. Now since I don't know how long to make the new fuel lines and I don't want to waste my fuel line, I'll just use the other end of the same line to start the filter line. I'll then cut both lines at the same time, which should then keep the waste down to a minimum. We'll then use the same method as before, but this time we need to pull out the line from the tank. That way we can then cut off the angle piece and then install the fuel filter. But if your fuel filter has corrosion or scaling on it and you want to reuse it, you'll need to clean not only the outside but the inside as well. Now personally, if it was that bad, I would not risk it and instead just replace it, but you're welcome to do what you want with it. Now these fuel filters are not that expensive, but if you buy a pack of 3 or more, you'll get an even better deal. The next part is kind of tricky. Push the filter back into the fuel tank. However, you'll need to make sure that the filter is in a good location. Otherwise, you risk the chance of having the fuel filter come out of the fuel once it starts to get low. I've decided to locate the filter on the far end of the fuel tank, which should keep the engine running when edging on its side. Just be careful and not get the filter too far into the tank, otherwise it'll ride up the side of the fuel tank, which could cause the issue we're trying to avoid. I'm not going to worry about the fuel lines just yet until we've inspected the carb, and the first place I want to look at is the metering diaphragm. Now without a working diaphragm, the carb won't be able to deliver fuel at all the engine speeds. And after removing the metal plate that protects it, it turns out the diaphragm is actually in pretty good condition. So yes, there are a couple of wrinkles in it, but because the diaphragm is still supple, they won't have any effect on how it works. Now because the diaphragm is still in great condition and we know the real problem was with the fuel lines instead, I'm going to make the choice to keep this diaphragm in there instead of replacing it. The other reason why is because I want to show you that the diaphragm does not need to look pristine to be usable. So what I'm doing is loosely installing just the carb to show you how I cut the fuel lines. If I was doing this for real though, the airbox would be in the way of filming, but once the lines are cut to length, we'll install them for the final time. Now it's up to you as to how much slack you want in the fuel lines, but I would recommend that you not make the lines taut. If you forgot which port is which, the easiest way is to find out which is the return port. So when you're pressing on the bulb, you should hear a sound, and if you cover up a port and that sound goes away, that port should be for the return line. And on this particular carb, the port closer to the bulb is the one making the sound, so it's the return port. After cutting both fuel lines roughly to length, we'll then take off the carb, that way we can install it the way it's supposed to be. This is not the only way to do this process, but it works well, especially if you've never done this before. Also, if you're not comfortable doing this kind of work, but don't want to take it to the repair shop, you can always ask around and find someone who's done this job before. I'm sure they'll be willing to help you with a bit of persuasion, and their chances of fixing it would be a lot higher than someone who's never done it before. Also, be sure that there's a gasket between the carb and the engine, otherwise you're going to have a really tough time getting it to start and run properly. Now, if you don't have a gasket, you can always try making one out of some thin cardboard, but you'll need to be extremely precise when cutting it out. So when connecting the fuel lines, the filter line will connect to the port furthest away from the purge bulb. And of course, that means the return line will connect to the port closer to the bulb. Once the fuel lines have been connected, we can then test the fuel system by putting some fuel into the fuel tank and then purging the entire system. Now, if the purge bulb is not able to pull fuel from the tank, there's a problem most likely in the carb. It's then up to you to choose to take it back apart and see if something went wrong, or if you decide to just replace the entire carb. So when pressing on the purge bulb, fuel should come up the filter line, enter the carb, fill the bulb, then leave the carb through the return line and go back to the fuel tank. And as you can see, fuel is flowing through the lines just like it's supposed to. Now, if yours is not doing this, you can either go through the carb again or just buy a new carb instead. I know I sound a bit repetitive by saying replace the carb, but I think most consumers are not willing or eager to open up a carb for an inspection. But to be honest, there's nothing at risk by taking apart that old carb, because if it's bad, you're going to need to replace it anyway. So what you're looking at are the fuel adjustment screws, but to turn them, you'll need a special tool, or you can get a bit creative. Now for this particular carb, it needs to be the splined version of the tool, but when you get a kit, it'll come with several other versions as well. Now to tune your carb, the screws are located near the front and near the bottom edge of it. The screw closer to the engine is the L screw, and it's for low speed fuel adjustment, while the screw near the air filter is the H screw, and it's for high speed fuel adjustment. Now don't be surprised if you need to adjust the idle speed as well, because adjusting fuel at lower speeds has a way of changing the idle speed. All we need to do now is start up the engine and see if we need to make any adjustments. So for the most part, it's running really well, if not just a bit too fast, and that's because the trimmer head won't stop spinning. However, that might not be a problem. We need to make sure that this trimmer is even equipped with a clutch, and to find out, all we have to do is turn the trimmer head by hand. And as you can see, I'm not able to spin the head independently of the engine, which means this engine has no clutch. That means the trimmer head is always going to be spinning just so long as the engine is running. Now the engine speed is still a little too high for me, so I'm going to turn out the idle speed screw just a bit, and that should take care of it. Now don't worry, I did start the engine off camera to make sure that the engine speed was where I wanted it to be at. Now looking back at my old footage from years ago on this trimmer, the fuel lines looked okay, but in retrospect, I probably should have changed them back then to avoid this whole situation. Now I don't mind when customers try and fix their own stuff, but if they don't get very far into it, I typically end up fixing not only the problem, but also what the customer broke during their attempt. Now they didn't make that much of a mess this time, but it did have me wondering what happened to it all. So my question is, have you ever tried fixing something only for you to give up on it and hand it over to someone else? No problem if you had to. In fact, doing so I think is a wise choice to make. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.